Welcome to our continuing series of virtual voices focusing on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Today we have Professor Barnett Koven, who is a national security specialist and data scientist with a decade's experience in counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, and strategic competition. He has extensive expertise in leading analytics teams, applying quantitative and qualitative approaches to national security, combining research, design, inferential statistics, machine learning, and applied AL survey experimental research and data visualization. Professor Coven also possesses extensive experience in the field, having lived and worked in conflict and post-conflict settings on multiple continents. Over to you, Barnett.
Well, thank you all for taking the time to join me today and to join Dr. Gerбach and the rest of the WIT team. I'm very happy to be back and presenting to this group. I wanted to talk a little bit today about a book I wrote a couple years ago now, published by Joint Special Operations University Press, on various barriers to special operations forces-led counterterrorism effectiveness. I think this is topical even today, right? The U.S. government, as well as sort of allies and partners around the world, spent the last 2 decades or so focused very heavily, at least in a national security space, on terrorism and counterterrorism. And while the sort of attention of the national security community has shifted, right, there's a real sort of focus now on strategic competition, that is competition between the United States and peer and near-peer competitors, some of which we see unfolding on the battlefield today in Ukraine as a result of Russia's aggression there. I think a lot of sort of the limitations that we saw in this sort of previous 2 decades of conflict apply to sort of the current era as well as in some cases, some of the interagency sort of difficulties the U.S. government has faced arguably have applicability for themes well beyond just sort of national security. And so what I wanted to do is give you a sort of brief overview of the book. I hope you'll take a look at the sort of book itself. The nice thing about this particular book is it is totally free, right? This was published by the U.S. government, which means you can download a PDF right off of JSOU's website. But even if not, it unfolds in a couple of different parts. It begins with an introduction, looking at the absence of sort of strategy and grand strategy in particular in government planning for counterterrorism, despite engaging in this for 20+ years. And again, I think this is a theme that should resonate, especially for anyone who's worked in government for an extended period of time. We often get very good at focusing on sort of the tactical, focusing on sort of interventions on a day-to-day basis that work and work well, without thinking about the sort of bigger picture. Do these stack up and sort of result in the desired effect over the long run? And in the case of counterterrorism, unfortunately, a lot of these short-term successes were quite limited long-term efficacy. The next part of the book takes a look at sort of theory and sort of the academic literature, looking at first sort of terrorism and counterterrorism and sort of contrasting between theory and practice. The second chapter thinks about what we could have done more strategically in this fight. The third chapter focuses in on the interagency and sort of the limitations of large bureaucracies in government. And then the fourth chapter takes a look at sort of partnering between the U.S. and allied and partner nations, and how, unfortunately, in some cases, these went very well, but in many cases, we ended up mapping on some of the problems that we faced in the U.S. on top of what our partners were doing. The second part of the book sort of tries to explicate some of these more academic or sort of cerebral themes through 2 detailed case studies, one looking at Colombia, and then the next is looking at the Philippines. And then the third part of the book, I think, really sort of proceeds with practitioner in mind, practitioners in mind, and tries to offer specific practical suggestions for low-level bureaucrats as well as sort of senior policymakers and everyone in between. So with that sort of overview in place, I want to delve into the weeds just a little bit more. And sort of one thing we'll note is the need to sort of maintain flexibility and definitional flexibility in particular. And so I spent a lot of time looking at how the government defines a problem they're facing. And so in this case, we're talking about terrorism, but the same logic again would apply to sort of any health, environmental, et cetera, problems that the government sees as a whole of nation problem. And unfortunately, we conducted a study looking at definitions across 22 U.S. Government departments and agencies, and not one of them defined terrorism and counterterrorism in precisely the same way. And for some of you, that may be a shocking realization. This is not, but I want to unpack that just a little bit more. This is not just a product of sort of government dysfunction. It is very sort of targeted in nature, and this is very purposeful in nature, right? Each department and agency saw that this was a major goal of the administration, and I mean this for multiple administrations, Bush 43, Obama, Trump, etc. And as a result, they sought to define the problem in terms that were specific to their department or agency that would give them sort of preeminence in sort of solving this issue, and also give them an advantage in obtaining a larger share of the sort of budget that was available to confront this pressing threat. So the Department of Homeland Security is a great example. It is the only agency that listed critical infrastructure protection as sort of front and center in how it defined terrorism and counterterrorism. And this makes perfect sense. If you look at DHS's charter, it's very clear. Congress endowed them with the lead role for critical infrastructure protection. That being said, this creates a lot of problems, right? It's very hard to come together and collectively solve a common problem if no one at the table agrees fully on the scope of the problem, nor sort of the full scope of the solution. With that said, I wanted to sort of just take a quick look as part of the introduction here at some of at sort of what the future might have in store. One, I think we've taken a really heavy focus on the role of sort of the military as part of these solutions without sort of endowing enough sort of attention to the rest of the interagency. Terrorism, for example, is an inherently political problem. Countering it, therefore, needs to be as well. And this is something the military cannot do alone. It needs the State Department, it needs the Treasury Department, etc. The threat here is also not subsiding, even as the U.S. government shifts its focus. And the result then is that we need to be able to do more with less. And I mean less in a number of respects: less political attention, less political will, less financial and personnel resources, etc. Right? This means we need to do better at working across the interagency, which, as I just articulated, is quite challenging at some times, and do better at sort of engaging foreign partners. In terms of sort of the track record so far, I want to look at sort of where we are, right? I think tactically, hugely successful. The U.S. military has sort of honed their skill set at targeting sort of terrorist groups, terrorist leaders, etc., over the last 20 years, and is able to strike successfully just about anywhere on Earth today. But this doesn't translate into strategic outcomes that are particularly useful. Unfortunately, a lot of sort of these military interventions merely exacerbate the problem. And let me give you a couple of examples there. In sort of the U.S. campaigns in Afghanistan and Iraq, one thing that was observed was the sort of definition or the local belief as to sort of who was a threat and who wasn't didn't necessarily match ours. So in certain foreign environments, you might have the U.S. military go in, targeting a senior leader, and in the process kill individuals pulling security for that leader. They are legitimate military targets under the laws of war. They're military-aged men, armed to the teeth, etc. But the local population sees them as sort of their family members who are caught in between and had no choice but to sort of provide security while these leaders were in their village, or else face sort of retribution that would have been far worse. And so in prosecuting that sort of high-level target, the military also creates potentially these local grievances that help sort of fuel the next wave and the next wave and the next wave of recruitment. General Stanley McChrystal famously referred to this as counterterrorism or counterinsurgency mass. The idea being that if you have a village that has 100 people in it, of which 10 are bad actors, and you go in and you kill 15 people, how many sort of bad people are left? The argument there was the other 85, because you killed individuals or harmed individuals who were seen by the local population, irrespective of your own definitions, as being innocent, and in doing so, sort of help radicalize, help sort of feed the next wave of sort of resource mobilization. Unfortunately, as a result, sort of these disruption-centric approaches to counterterrorism that are law enforcement or military heavy do not work well in practice. It's almost like playing a game of whack-a-mole. And maybe some of you have seen this arcade game. You hit the mole with a hammer and another one pops up from the game board. It's sort of a never-ending Sisyphean task. Unfortunately, sort of the hard sort of counterterrorism approaches that rely on sort of military and law enforcement interventions need to be paired much more with interventions from the rest of the government that focus on remediating the root causes that lead to recruitment and radicalization. So this, I think, is the missing link in counterterrorism, right? We don't have a strategy. And that strategy should be a written document, ideally, that connects the sort of military means that are going to be employed to the desired political end, and mixes in, ideally, in sort of a grand strategic sense, the sort of rest of the interagency that can deal with these root causes, deal with the grievances, et cetera, that allow these groups to perpetuate. So the monograph that we wrote does not solve this, right? It doesn't sort of stipulate that the US government shall adopt X, Y, and Z as their grand strategy. But what I think it does do is sort of enhance our understanding of what barriers exist and how the absence of strategy and grand strategy has handicapped this fight for the last 2 years. And again, for those of you on the line who have no interest whatsoever in terrorism and counterterrorism, that's okay. I still think there's sort of value in this text in understanding the need to put together sort of a strategy, and ideally in a grand strategy, before government tries to tackle any large social problem. And so in the first chapter, we go into a great bit of detail about sort of what is terrorism. I realize I've been talking for quite a while, but I do want to sort of just take a step back here. I've sort of alluded to a couple of these aspects, and particularly sort of political nature of terrorism, right? Terrorist groups are using violence or the threat thereof in order to achieve political aims. And I use the term political very broadly speaking. This can be a change in sort of who governs. This can be a change in specific policies. So there's environmental extremist groups that really don't care who's in power, but do want better legislation to protect the environment and have unfortunately used violence to get there. It may have to deal with sort of how society or how the economy is organized. Historically speaking, sort of Marxist and Maoist inspired terrorism was far more virulent than sort of the Islamist and now sort of extreme, sort of domestic extremist violence that we're seeing sort of take center stage today. But the goal here is these are weak organizations that have a political agenda, but recognize that they cannot achieve that in a nonviolent way. And they also cannot stand up and fight a sort of set-piece military engagement and hope to win against even a sort of smaller power, let alone sort of the US military. And as such, they engage asymmetrically, targeting innocent civilians in the hopes that they will sort of influence government to change the course of their action through sort of the fear and coercion that their violence affects. Here's just sort of one particular definition that I think is sort of interesting that I threw out earlier, right? This is the DHS definition, and you can see sort of this critical infrastructure piece being sort of front and center. And you could again do this if you went through the entirety of the interagency's definitions. The goal for sort of terrorist groups is not just the sort of one attack that they're perpetrating, but the resource mobilization and sort of the broader fear across society that sort of engenders. In terms of counterterrorism, though, if terrorism is political, an effective counterterrorism strategy needs to recognize that, and it needs to target both the motivations as well as the capabilities of the group you're trying to counter. So sort of the military and law enforcement solutions that have been prioritized go after existing capabilities, but they do almost nothing to target the motivations, whether that's sort of discontent about how society is organized, discontent over economic inequality, sort of religious extremism, etc. And so I think that, in a nutshell, is the missing link here. A number of scholars have tried to put together sort of comprehensive lists about what counterterrorism is. Here's just an extrapolation from that. But again, I think it's impossible to sort of list out every single aspect. Nonetheless, you can see that even this sort of short list that Cynthia Lum and sort of her colleagues put together is quite broad. It includes sort of traditional sort of law enforcement techniques like arrest, but it also includes sort of diplomatic engagement and educational programs. You'll also note, given this audience, that there's a large role in Cynthia's work for the United Nations in the form of conventions, resolutions, and other types of support. Nonetheless, let's go back to definitions. And you'll see here's the Department of Defense, the lead agency in the United States for counterterrorism, and they define it extremely narrowly, right? The goal of counterterrorism is to neutralize the terrorist threat, presumably militarily. And again, this should not be surprising, given what we know about sort of each agency and department being incentivized to define the threat in terms that resonate with them. I think the U.S. government and sort of elected political leadership opted to employ the military because it was an easy button. It was relatively easy to deploy soldiers to go prosecute targets. And it was also relatively easy for elected leaders to get on CNN and claim success, claim mission accomplished after a successful raid or drone strike or thing of that sort. But doing so ignored the need for the U.S. Agency for International Development, for example, to go out and provide development assistance to better the lives of people who might have been otherwise susceptible to recruitment. It ignored the need for sort of Treasury Department to do sort of complex investigations into these sort of financial networks that undergird these threats. And when we're talking about groups like Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State, these are transnational organizations that are able to operate effectively across continents and across thousands of personnel resources, in part because of the sort of financial resources they have at their disposal. So I think I've already been pretty critical of this notion of sort of disruption, the sort of military and law enforcement intervention as the sort of dominant paradigm here. Nonetheless, we can see right here, there is no obvious correlation between U.S. government spending on a destruction-focused sort of counterterrorism strategy represented by this sort of dark red line up top, and the number of attacks either worldwide or in the United States. I think this is sort of really good initial sort of evidence that the strategy isn't working. This is perhaps the scariest and most pressing slide I will show you in the entirety of this block. But what it shows you is that even though the government may not have come up with a clear strategy for countering this threat, our opponents perhaps have. And so what this graph shows you is the sort of geographic spread of both Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State for sort of two example large terrorist organizations. And so what you see with Al-Qaeda first, this black line shows you the cumulative number of countries in which they've ever operated. The gray line at the bottom shows you the number of countries they're in at any given time. And right, so they've operated in more than 50 countries, and they're currently operational in well over a dozen. And what that does is it gives them strategic and temporal depth. Right, Al-Qaeda will celebrate its 35th birthday later this year, and they will celebrate that birthday despite having fought two superpowers. First, the Soviet Union during the anti-Soviet jihad or the Soviet-Afghan War from 1979 to 1989, and then subsequently the United States. And they're able to survive despite sort of this massive asymmetry because they exist in multiple different locations at once. This is like the problem of the Hydra, the multi-headed monster from ancient mythology, right? You cut off one head and it simply regenerates elsewhere. That's exactly what's happening and will continue to happen. To be successful against Al-Qaeda, you need to sort of cut off 12 to 15 heads at any given time, i.e. you need to neutralize them in the 15 or so countries they're operating in simultaneously. That in and of itself is scary. The sort of red and crimson line below or further to the right show this similar data for the Islamic State. But what you see here is the Islamic State has adopted Al-Qaeda's strategy, but they've grown exponentially, and they've done what Al-Qaeda did in 3+ decades in the course of about half a decade, expanding from a presence in just Iraq and Syria in the sort of mid-2010s, rapidly having a cumulative presence in more countries than Al-Qaeda, and having sort of an annual presence in 30+ countries at any given time. And this is why, unfortunately, it may not be me, but someone will be back giving the same talk or some version of it about 30 years from now, I suspect. So, hopefully I've sort of demonstrated that sort of this disruption-based approach doesn't seem to work particularly well. We've talked about a number of these themes. In the interest of time, I'm going to move on and suggest what we ought to be doing instead is looking at the counterinsurgency literature and taking a more comprehensive approach that pairs sort of military and law enforcement actions, which are absolutely going to be necessary to stop the next attack, with approaches to sort of deal with the root causes, the grievances that terrorist recruiters are experts at preying on in order to galvanize the next wave of recruits, the next sort of fundraising dollar, and so on and so forth. And empirics from the study of sort of counterinsurgency, including some of my own work, suggest that when used correctly and in a sort of synergistic and integrated manner, these tools can be quite effective over longer term. But doing so requires political will, right? It's not great from the sort of elected official standpoint because you're not likely to achieve sort of comprehensive results in a sort of 2-year congressional election timeframe in the United States. Rather, these can sort of yield results over the long run. And sort of being able to distance yourself from sort of political aims and objectives is going to likely be very necessary here. And let me just give you a couple of examples of things that did work. There was a small program, and it wasn't large enough, in my personal opinion, to be sort of highly effective on a strategic level, but there was a small program in Iraq called the Commander's Emergency Response Program, wherein individual sort of battlefield military commanders were given money that they could use for development assistance. And the sort of reviews from this program were unbelievable. You had a number of sort of senior ranking military officials touting the efficacy of these efforts. So one brigadier general talked about paying individuals to do something productive to sort of preclude them from joining a sort of terrorist organization simply for a paycheck. And the reality is that is the most common reason individuals join. We think about sort of ideology and sort of the importance of sort of radicalization and recruitment. That often happens later. I had a really good sort of friend I interviewed as part of this book who was an expert on the Afghan Taliban, and his best estimation was that about 4% of the Taliban were hardcore ideologues. The remainder were in it for other sort of less altruistic motivations, and the majority of which were sort of poor farmers who were looking to supplement their income during the off-agricultural season and were happy to do anything to sort of eke out a living, including anything else that was available to them if there were alternatives, and sort of resorted to joining, in that case, the Taliban because of the absence of alternatives, right? Those are solvable problems, but they're not quick problems to solve. I want to sort of, as I start to wrap up, quickly sort of deconflate terrorism and insurgency, right? These are different phenomena, but they are very closely interrelated. And so I've talked about sort of counterinsurgency and terrorism and counterterrorism together, but I want to make sure I don't leave anyone with sort of a biased understanding, right? Terrorism, I think the critical difference here is that even though they're both weapons of the weak, they're both asymmetrical in nature. Terrorism predominantly targets innocent civilians, whereas insurgency uses asymmetry to, in large measure, target sort of military and other security forces. But you rarely find an example where you see one in isolation from the other. You'll often see sort of insurgencies that employ terrorism and terrorists that fight as though they're insurgents at times in their history and in certain sort of geographic spaces. This is a theme that we explore pretty substantially in the book that I'm not going to get into in sort of the interest of time here. And Dr. Durbeck, I did want to ask you, at what point would you like me to sort of stop and take and pause for sort of questions or commentary?
Actually, Barnett, you still have about 12 minutes to talk, and then we will go with questions. We have a lot of questions already, but so far your presentation is excellent. So basically, I just wanted to mention, I think history should have taught us that transforming evil does not exist. The only thing that exists is getting rid of it. Over to you.
Excellent. No, that's great to hear, and thank you. I'm glad you're enjoying it. So I will continue then for a little bit. Instead of talking about the empirics on that slide, though, I do want to sort of, since I've articulated a strategy that focuses very much on sort of counterinsurgency, in that it takes a much more holistic look, including both the military disruption, but also the development assistance, the governance reform, etc. I do want to unpack some limitations, right? Counterinsurgency strategy is not a panacea here. First off, there's this reality that not all violent extremists can be won over. And so I mentioned this very briefly in the Afghanistan case, but let me elaborate just in a little bit more detail. And so this one Afghan expert I spoke to referred to sort of three flavors of Afghan Taliban. And he said they're the ideologues, they're about 4% of the group, and in his words, he said there's no choice but to kill them. And I think in a limited extent, he was correct here in that as long as they had influence over the population, they were going to continue to do damage. So they had to be sort of neutralized in some way, whether that meant getting killed in a battlefield military operation, being incarcerated, and otherwise sort of taken out of sort of a position of influence on the population, or what have you. There was no sort of reforming that 4%. But he referred to sort of the other portion of the Taliban, about 20 to 30% being what he called mercenary Taliban. And these were local enterprising political elites who in the early days of the sort of U.S. intervention in Afghanistan between 2001 and 2004 were very happy to partner with the U.S. because at that point, the U.S. government was turning a blind eye to their criminal activity. Right, a number of these individuals were engaged in sort of large-scale cultivation of opium poppy for the ultimate production of heroin. And as long as they were able to sort of continue engaging in their illicit activities and continue to sort of control the sort of small geographic spaces that were their fiefdoms or that they treated as such, they were happy to partner with whatever side offered them the best deal. Once the U.S. government started pursuing counter-narcotics pretty rigorously in Afghanistan, these mercenary Taliban flipped to the side of the mercenary groups flipped to become mercenary members of the Taliban, right? They changed their allegiance. The Taliban was really adept for their part at sort of picking up on sort of the U.S. government's change in attitude. So originally, sort of Taliban ideology and doctrine would tell you that anything to do with drugs is haram, it's forbidden. After 2004, once they realized the U.S. government was going to criminalize narcotics and they had an opportunity, they changed their narrative slightly. So they said the use of heroin is still forbidden for a good Muslim. But if you want to grow opium poppy that will then be used to fund the war effort against the West, and as an added benefit, addict Americans and Western Europeans and so on and so forth to this highly sort of toxic substance, have right at it. So they were able to sort of welcome these individuals in their open arms. But then the final flavor was what he referred to as sort of the paycheck Taliban, right? 70+% of the group in terms of size, and these were largely poor farmers who had no interest in participating when it was time to plant or harvest their crops, but were willing to work for a small paycheck, about $200 US dollars equivalent a month, to anyone who provided it, because that was the only way to feed their families in much of sort of rural southern Afghanistan. Development assistance and governance reform made huge inroads at winning over the paycheck Taliban, and right, very large numbers were paid to build roads, to build wells, to build schools, to do sort of meaningful things that improved the sort of state of development of their communities, and actually preferred doing that than something destructive. Just needed a way to take care of their families in the absence of a functional state, in the absence of functional social services, etc. That being said, that minimal level of development was not possible without some sort of basic level security safeguards. So even though I was very critical in the front end of this talk about sort of the role the military and sort of law enforcement have played in counterterrorism, you can't get rid of their role in this fight. You can't do development aid in a sort of complete and utter war zone that is wholly unsecure. You don't need to be fully in a state of peace either, but there is sort of a balancing act here, and I think that's really important to take into mind. The other thing that's worth considering is you don't win hearts and minds overnight. This is a long-term investment, and importantly, a long-term investment that needs to be sustained and sustained across electoral cycles. Paradoxically, one of the worst things the sort of statistical evidence suggests you can do is start doing this type of building expectations that it's going to continue and then abruptly stopping, right? People then have sort of a psychological expectation of more assistance and more of the same, and you are suddenly the actor that took that away from them, that robbed them of these newfound expectations, and that can be quite deleterious. In short, we need to think about sort of when do you use disruption and how do you pair it with sort of these other approaches. And I think the answer is you use disruption when there's an imminent attack pending and when there's no other sort of a way of doing an intervention to stop it. And you use disruption in order to establish a minimum level of security in order to flow through these other sort of softer tools like development assistance and governance reform. Very quickly, though, this is easy to say. It's easy for me to talk about. It's really hard to execute in practice. All large bureaucracies have what's called core mission bias, right? The Department of Defense's focus, their sort of raison d'etre, their reason for existing, is to fight and win the nation's wars. So it's hard to convince them that they should be devoting more resources to development aid and governance reform as opposed to sort of fighting and killing bad guys. And the same will exist across the interagency. The Department of State is going to have a hard time sort of recognizing that its role is something other than to be the sort of lead diplomat, and so on and so forth. The second bit here is these are hyper complex scenarios that often happen at the local level and have a fair bit of nuance. This cannot be solved through policy that's dictated from on high. The governments that are going to be most successful at tackling these types of challenges are going to be the ones that are willing to devolve a significant degree of authority and autonomy to sort of junior personnel who are actually on the ground. And this is an area where the U.S. military is quite good at sort of giving authority and giving a lot of latitude to junior officers and non-commissioned officers. This is also something that sort of authoritarian states are quite bad at. And I think one reason, one amongst many, we've seen sort of Russian forces fare so badly on the battlefield of Ukraine, in addition, of course, to the sort of resolute defenses by Ukrainian forces, which in and of itself is very, very impressive, is because of sort of the extreme hierarchy and the unwillingness to sort of devolve significant levels of sort of authority or decision-making to sort of low-level subordinates. And then finally, this is not something you can do quickly. both in terms of not achieving results quickly, but also in terms of sort of the necessary training and sort of skills building across the government to be effective in these types of environments. We ought to be starting that 10 years ahead of sort of needing it. And there's a real sort of push within the Department of Defense to rebuild a lot of the skills that have atrophied, especially within the special operations community. And I think sort of the conflicts in Ukraine, Syria, and elsewhere are sort of demonstrating the need for the next generation of soldiers to not just be warriors, but to be, in sort of one term, warrior diplomats, adept at sort of negotiations, adept at building local capacity, adept at brokering sort of deals on the ground, not just putting sort of bullets and bombs downrange. Another sort of barrier here that's worth talking about is political infeasibility, right? These tools work when our politicians are willing to use them and willing to play the long game, and when sort of more junior leaders are sort of see the value. And so the photo here is some time I spent in Benin, a small West African country that was having some serious problems with Al Qaeda, the Islamic State, as well as some spillover from Boko Haram from neighboring Nigeria. And the real problem there was, in my personal opinion, some somewhat myopic thinking on the part of sort of Beninois leadership about this being a purely sort of military task. And so I spent a fair bit of time on the ground with local forces, training them to sort of build rapport with the local communities and sort of rebuild those relationships as a more effective counterterrorism tool than what they were doing. And it was quite an enjoyable experience. Finally, though, before I turn it over to Dr. Gerbach to moderate sort of the Q&A, one thing we ought to be doing, though, is carefully capturing a record of these limitations, as well as what has worked in our doctrine, in our planning documents. And we ought to do that now before these lessons atrophy as we shift to the next big fight or the next big sort of foreign policy and national security objective. And critically, the best way to capture this is through sort of sound empirical measurement. And so I was debating whether or not, when I was putting together these slides, do I want to show you a ton of charts and figures? And I picked a couple, but I limited it. I could have made this a talk that was purely statistical in nature, and I thought maybe a few of you would get bored. But the reality is there's a lot of data undergirding everything I've talked about here, and it's important that we capture that because the sort of empirical evidence is worth a lot more than sort of the conjecture and the anecdote that I've been sort of articulating here, at least if you're going to sort of talk to an audience that is skeptical. And I think this is a pretty sort of intelligent, well-informed audience, so I may not have that sort of barrier going in, but there are other versions of this talk depending on who I'm giving it to. Dr. Gerbach, over to you.
Thank you very much, Barnett. That was just a wonderful and very educational, thorough presentation. If you can, drop us a line on the website for the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses. And now we have many questions, and I will turn it over to our moderator, Susie Halleck. Over to you, Susie.
Thank you, Dr. Gerbach, and thank you, Barnett, for such an insightful presentation. You sparked a lot of questions from the audience. So the first one being, what led you to study this topic, and can you describe the way you conduct your research to stay informed?
Yeah, absolutely. And so the book itself was a passion project, and it had been something I had wanted to write for a long time. And one silver lining of the COVID pandemic is it gave me enough of a break in my schedule to actually get pen to paper here. But the research for this had been done piecemeal over almost a decade sort of prior to actually writing. And so I first started off as part of my sort of doctoral dissertation looking at counterinsurgency strategy in 4 really different cases: Iraq, Afghanistan, Peru, and Colombia. And so a lot of this sort of empirical evidence from Iraq and Afghanistan was at least surfaced from the archive then, even if I went back to it years later. Then in the intervening sort of 6 years after grad school, I was at the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism, largely doing a combination of sort of government-funded research. So I had a number of sort of DoD funded research grants, that paid for sort of individual pieces of this sort of data collection, data analysis, going to the field to conduct interviews, etc., as well as teaching practitioners. So I continue to teach for Joint Special Operations University, which is just an amazing opportunity because I learned probably more from my students who are all seasoned professionals who have been doing this for decades than they learned from me. So sort of took anecdotes from there as well. In terms of the actual approach to sort of the research, though, I try and use mixed methods. The sort of statistical evidence is especially strong when it's sort of cross-validated with archival information, with interviews on the ground and things of that sort. So I've spent multiple years in the field at this point around the world. I'll often spend a little bit of time trying to gather the quantitative data if it exists, a few weeks to a few months, depending on how much time I have in a country, in the archives, sucking up whatever I can. But I'll spend the bulk of my time talking to people, and ideally talking to people of all walks of life. So I want to talk to the senior-most officials on the government side who will speak with me, but I also want to talk to the rank and file in the sort of military and sort of security apparatuses, but also the rest of the state government. Certainly individuals who are caught in the middle. I really find there's good perspective from the people who don't necessarily do this for a living, but are nonetheless living in that conflict environment. And where possible, it's useful to have both sides of the story. So in some conflict zones like Colombia, where there has been a fair bit of demobilization, it is possible to safely speak with former terrorists or former insurgents. In other cases, that's obviously not possible. So one real gap is I talk a lot about the Islamic State. I have done 0 interviews with members of the Islamic State, and unfortunately, there isn't a safe way for me to do that. So there are clear limitations in studying these types of topics as well.
That's fascinating. How do you see the study of terrorism and responses to terrorism evolving over the next decade?
Yeah, so I think there's been a lot of interest in a lot of sort of younger academics who got focused on this after 9/11. I think the space for this type of work is shrinking, unfortunately, because if you look at sort of government priorities, if you read just the National Defense Strategy or the National Security Strategies of the United States, what you see is whereas for the last 20 years, terrorism was threat number 1. Now it's China first, and then sort of closely thereafter, Russia, and then sort of Iran, North Korea. So the interest within sort of government funders, and the reality is field research is expensive, is sort of waning. So that's going to limit the scope of sort of additional research. And on that front, I think it's really important that those who sort of continue in the field produce sort of rigorous work and look at sort of a mixed set of evidence. It does not mean, however, we should sort of stop, though, because even though the U.S. government's focus is shifting, the threat hasn't subsided, right? Al-Qaeda didn't say, oh, the U.S. government is focusing more on Russia and China than us. We're going to pack up and go on a vacation. Quite the opposite.
That makes sense. So what role do technology and innovation play in increasing the effectiveness of special operations forces-led counterterrorism operations, and what are some of the challenges?
Yeah, so my sort of personal opinion here is the U.S. and sort of wealthy Western nations are too reliant on technology. And so the U.S., at least since the Vietnam War, sort of the first sort of televised war, we've realized the American public is very casualty adverse, and for good reason. But our solution has been throwing lots of money, which often gets translated into technology, at these problems, often without evaluating how effective those approaches are. And so, I mean, Dr. Derbeck has driven with me, and she can attest to the fact that I cannot get where I'm going without the GPS navigation in my car. And that's probably not a good thing, because what happens if you have to operate without the assistance of that technology? And by the way, if you end up fighting a sort of peer or sort of equal level competitor like the Chinese, there's a good chance that your technology will not work due to sort of actions on their part. The other thing that sort of this reliance on technology has done, even with respect to the terrorism and counterterrorism fight, is sort of led to a focus on sort of people who are more adept with technology and perhaps less adept with the people skills. What worked early on in following 2001, 9/11, 2001, was the ability of special forces troops on the ground in Afghanistan to unite the Northern Alliance and get this sort of loose amalgamation of individuals to behave as a sort of cohesive entity. That required people skills, sort of negotiation, diplomacy. It didn't require sort of computers or other types of sophisticated kit. And ultimately, successful special operations forces, what matters most is what's sort of in here, not what kind of sort of advanced 23rd century technology they're equipped with, even though it's sort of, we tend to focus on that because it is sexy, for lack of a better phrasing.
That makes sense. So how do you think you can balance having a strong military to yield positive global influence, especially in times like the Ukraine-Russia war, without increasing military spend too significantly and balancing with other priorities? Is this even possible?
Yeah, I think the focus needs to be, so there's also sort of a budgetary fight going on every day within the U.S. government, who sort of, the department captures the largest share. So it can't be sort of, you're not going to be successful if you sort of make the argument that we need to spend less money. I think the sort of more successful argument is where we're putting that money. And I think there's a natural sort of belief among sort of senior leaders who have spent 30 years in the armed forces that investing in the people is a good bet. So really trying to amplify those narratives rather than we need a new Joint Strike Fighter at a cost of nearly $200 million per airframe in the form of the F-35, for example, is where I would sort of focus my time and attention.
That makes sense. And what do you think are the top 3 strategic changes we need to make the U.S. military more effective?
Yeah, so number one is the last 20 years were about direct action counterterrorism. The next 20 years are likely about countering sort of peer and near peer competitors. So principally sort of Russia, China. That's less direct action and more sort of work by, with, and through partners and allies. So a lot of what you're seeing in Ukraine, wherein U.S. military forces may not be on the front lines engaged in the shooting, but are nonetheless impactfully equipping our Ukrainian partners to do so, and with impressive results on the part of Ukraine. Sort of related to that, though, U.S. forces need to be able to operate in sort of a non-kinetic fashion in denied areas. So there really needs to be a renewed focus on sort of state building, sort of diplomacy, negotiations, language skills. One of the things that really got cut pretty substantially from special forces training over the last 20 years was the amount of time and attention to language skills. That needs to come back. And obviously some languages are sort of more salient than others in this current moment. And then the sort of third thing is asymmetric thinking. So one thing that really did wonders during the Cold War was this notion that we can impose sort of asymmetric costs and force the opponent to massively overinvest. And so I'll give you an unclassified, really old example that was used very effectively against Russia, or well, then the Soviet Union, but I'm really talking about sort of leadership in Moscow. During the beginning of the Cold War, we had that nuclear arms race that everyone's very familiar with from their history books. And there was this debate within the Department of Defense: do we invest our resources in building strategic nuclear bombers or intercontinental ballistic missiles? And the scientists and the Air Force said, go with the ballistic missiles. They're cheaper in terms of payload per sort of cost of delivery vehicle. They're more accurate, and they're impossible, at least given the technology of the 1950s and 60s, to defeat. There was an individual called Andy Marshall who came in and said, all that is true, buy more bombers. And his rationale was we need to be able to get in the head of the enemy and sort of force them to make dumb decisions based on their own predispositions. And he said the Soviet sort of military elite are paranoid about violations of their nation's sovereignty, which makes sense. Look at how many times Russia had been invaded back from sort of the Tsarist time through the 2 world wars. And in particular, they're paranoid right now about sort of violations of their airspace as a result of what the German Luftwaffe did during the Second World War. If you buy more strategic bombers, the Soviet Union will invest in integrated air defense systems, which cost 10 times more than the bombers and can only be used defensively. They cannot be used to target the United States homeland. So what you're doing there is forcing them to spend 10 times more on something that can't hurt you. And it's sort of that type of thinking that needs to happen at every level, from the anti-marshals who are in the inner circle of the Pentagon down to the junior enlisted soldier, to actually sort of win these fights with the minimum amount of bloodshed, right? I'd rather win through that type of engagement than having people kill each other on the battlefield. It's not always possible to preclude the latter, but you can sort of minimize how much of sort of these bloody fights like we're seeing in Ukraine sort of materialize if we're smart.
That makes sense. Your second recommendation around language ties back to a question we received, which is how can the role of cultural differences and language barriers influence the effectiveness of special operations forces-led counterterrorism operations?
Absolutely. So Americans are very sort of get to the point, business focused in sort of our communication abroad. For this type of work, if you are working with partners, there needs to be a certain degree of trust. And often that means we need to slow down and work on sort of building those relations. So our sort of go, go, go mentality needs to sort of cease. And it may be important to sit down and have tea with your sort of counterparts, talk about family, talk about sports, whatever it is to sort of build that connective tissue before we can get focused on the mission. And it's really hard to do that. It's hard to get business people to sort of focus on that in like negotiations over a merger and acquisition or something of that sort, but it works there. It's exponentially harder in the middle of an ongoing conflict where people are shooting and there's a sort of real importance to time. But that sort of upfront investment in building understanding, building meaningful relationships will pay massive dividends if we're willing to sort of take a pause and do so. And I think that's sort of one huge difference between sort of U.S. culture versus cultures in much of the developing world. And sort of if you just solve that, you'd be making a huge step forward.
In your research, were you impressed by a certain country's military, and why do you think it was run well from your perspective?
Colombia. And so the Colombians went from extremely low standards to being one of the most capable forces in the region, and one that now trains a lot of the personnel in neighboring countries. And it happened as a result of really good leadership who were willing to play the long game and make sort of decade-long investment. And I think the U.S. government likes to say, oh, well, this was Plan Colombia. This was a result of the U.S. government's initiative. And as much as I'd like to, as an American, say, yes, that's true, I would say we, the U.S., helped around the margins. The Colombians sort of took the right steps and put the big pieces in place on their own. And that led them to be highly successful. And not just highly successful on the military, but sort of embracing sort of norms that Western audiences sort of hold really important. So like their belief in the need to protect human rights and all these other things that you'll hear very commonly in sort of the U.S. military was deeply ensconced. And it wasn't because the U.S. sort of lectured at them, you need to be cognizant of human rights. They saw how that sort of translated into sort of effectiveness and sort of winning popular support amongst the sort of rural population. So really lots of really good success stories there. Unfortunately, hard to replicate because it took a fair bit of sort of brilliance and commitment on the part of their leadership.
Very impressive. With the increased terrorist risks we're facing, like you said, from China, Russia, North Korea, Middle East, is it important for the U.S. to remain a strong military power, and why?
Yes, but not at the expense of everything else. There probably needs to be more investment in non-kinetic tool sets. And so I was reading a Office of the Inspector General report on the Global Engagement Center at the State Department. That's the entity tasked with leading information operations. And it did not paint the GEC a particularly good light. But if you look at the budget, of course it didn't. Their budget is a small fraction of one airplane in the military. So do you need military strength in order to effectively operate and sort of establish base levels of stability to help build partner capacity? Absolutely. But it can't be at the expense of everything else. Otherwise, you're just going to use the military and you're going to be back in the trap that I was sort of articulating at the beginning of this lecture.
Thank you. Next question is, what do you believe are the greatest terrorist risks our nation is expected to face in the future?
In the U.S., it's domestic violent extremism now. And if you look at the last sort of 5 years of historical data, you're seeing 4 to 6 attempted or successful attacks by domestic groups for every one attack by an Islamist extremist group like Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State. And then again, that's a new trend in the last half decade or so. But I think the one thing that sort of the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda did very well was sort of get these sort of instructions for how to do attacks effectively, like the tactics, techniques, and procedures for bomb making, for target selection, et cetera, out there in the public domain. And other groups with totally different ideologies have sort of taken that and ran with it. So we're seeing that sort of spill over into sort of domestic violent extremist groups on both sides of the political spectrum. And just empirically, those are the groups that are perpetrating more attacks than anyone else in the U.S. homeland. It's a common sort of refrain as well if you look at sort of Western Europe, right? Germany has really, really good data, and it shows much the same results, for example.
Thank you. So a lot of our audience members are joining in from Ukraine, and so we've received a lot of questions on the Ukraine-Russia war. First one being, Ukraine has been suffering from Russian terrorism for almost 9 years. In your opinion, should Russia be categorized as a terrorist country, and what are the consequences for the U.S.?
Yeah, so in the U.S., we have something called the list of designated terrorist organizations, or DTOs. This is a list that the State Department maintains. Importantly, these are only foreign groups, so we do not list sort of domestic violent extremist groups on there. But if you are on that list, it entails sort of sanctions, as well as it makes it easier for these individuals to be prosecuted in a U.S. court system, which probably isn't all that relevant for the sort of Ukraine-Russia fight, right? So they're not individuals who are likely to be apprehended by U.S. law enforcement. So in that sense, the designation, whether if sort of you designated Russia as a whole, although the U.S. government is reticent to designate state actors as terrorist groups for fear of being designated themselves. There have been exceptions in the form of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is part of the Iranian military, but that is the only exception I'm aware of. But whether they designated Russia or certain groups within Russia, perhaps sort of like Russian-aligned militias, it would perhaps be a symbolic victory for Ukraine. I'm not sure it would have that much teeth that would actually sort of change how things were playing out on the battlefield. Yes, it would give sort of sanctions and other authorities that could be consequential, but the U.S. government is already doing that with respect to Russia, independent of that designation. So unfortunately, I'm not sure it would if sort of an official designation by the U.S. would really change things on the ground for Russia or Ukraine.
That makes sense. And how do you feel about the activities of the Russian terrorist organization Wagner, and do you think their presence in Africa is necessary?
So Wagner and sort of other smaller private military companies are a really interesting phenomena. And I am not by any sense an expert on that. But I do think they provide a number of sort of valuable sort of things for the Russian regime. So first off, some of their work in sort of Central Africa, wherein they're providing security for dictatorial regimes in exchange for natural resources like gold and other things, helps sort of provide the Russian state with a source of financial resources despite pressure from sanctions and sort of embargoes on their oil and gas and so on and so forth. So they're definitely providing a financial lifeline to Russia. I have not seen good empirics on sort of just how impactful that is. I think there's also, if you want to get creative, an interesting opportunity to use this to your advantage. And so some of you may have seen that contractors tied to Wagner attacked a Chinese mine relatively recently and killed a number of sort of Chinese persons at that time, right? There's a risk that this type of activity draws sort of Russia and China into conflict. And so if I were, this is purely hypothetical, but if I was a Ukrainian military, in the Ukrainian military and responsible for information operations, I might consider, do I want to amplify sort of narratives around that? It's a true story, and it's one that could potentially create tensions between sort of China and Russia, which we now know, thanks to open source reporting, China is definitively providing military assistance to Russia. So I think there's a lot to pull on there, but again, I'm not an expert on sort of the Wagner Group or sort of Russian private military contractors.
Thanks for the insights. So how can we fight terrorism with the help of modern media? More specifically, how should the media cover terrorist acts so that we help counteract and respond to propaganda?
Yeah, so first off, there's a massive first mover sort of advantage here. Whoever gets the narrative out first is likely to win, in the sense that that's going to be what gets picked up. So truth is sort of secondary. As sort of I'm not saying that sort of Western governments should be sort of lying. In fact, I think that's an easy way to lose credibility. But I think we need to be much, much faster in sort of getting the narrative out to sort of counter disinformation by a variety of sort of extremist groups. Secondly, it is far better, far more credible if sort of the narratives are coming from local audiences. So building capacity for local journalism, local media is going to be far more useful than just sort of relying on the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or sort of what have you. And then thirdly, on sort of the media front, we are, and this is sort of tangential to the question, but I will throw it out there, we need to do a much, much better job of encouraging our young people to be sort of critical consumers of the media and to sort of think critically about whatever they're reading, watching, liking, retweeting, et cetera, et cetera. That's the way to win, but that's a long-term solution. We're not going to fix that next week.
Yeah, definitely agree on that one. So what is needed to eliminate the terrorist organizations of the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant? You know, it's a very loaded question.
Rob them of their support. So ensure that there is no next generation willing to join or provide financial assistance, which means dealing with the root causes, right? The Islamic State was really good about sending people who look more like me in terms of social science training into sort of future conflict zones, identifying local grievances, identifying sort of local fissures within sort of ethnic or tribal or whatever groups, and exploiting that to recruit. So before you had someone show up with a rifle or a bomb, you had someone show up to sort of better understand the human terrain. And as long as those sort of fissures exist that they can tap into, they're going to continue to be able to recruit and excite the next generation, which is why this is sort of a long-term proposition and why it requires sort of these non-kinetic interventions.
Interesting. So I recently read an article which revealed certain drug cartels in Latin America were historically connected to terrorist organizations in the Middle East, such as Hezbollah. Are you aware of such or similar connections?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting phenomena. And so there are some sort of drug cartels that will not touch terrorism. So a number of sort of the Mexican cartels have decided, you know what, we're way too close to the U.S. homeland and to the U.S. border. We could make a ton of money by using sort of our narco trafficking route to help smuggle in fissile material or terrorist fighters or whatnot. But the second we do that, we're going to have the full weight of the U.S. government aligned against us. And that's going to hurt our core business, which is producing and sort of trafficking narcotics. So a lot more narco trafficking groups said no to terrorism or sort of helping terrorism than said yes. That being said, those logistics, those smuggling routes, et cetera, that work for our narcotics work very well for all kinds of other illicit activity and are highly prized by terrorist organizations. So Lebanese Hezbollah, for example, has a large presence in the southern cone of Latin America, where they engage not so much in terrorism, but petty criminality that generates financial resources that then get channeled back to the Middle East and used to fund terrorism there. There are other examples outside of the region. So the Haqqani network in Afghanistan and Pakistan, this is Kani family, primarily smugglers of pretty much everything from narcotics to minerals to timber, etc., but through it very tightly with the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and helped move their personnel as well as weapons and help sort of plot complex coordinated attacks, and are now part of the Taliban government, but very much started off as organized criminal, not terrorists.
Wow, very interesting. What are the most effective ways to weaken terrorist groups?
Yeah. So again, in the long run, it's denying them sort of the resource base. In the short to medium run, it's focusing on the logistics networks, right? So less the individual on the front line with the rifle or the bomb, and more the person doing human resources or payroll. There's a great database called the Harmony Project that is maintained by the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, and it covers over 1 million captured records from the Islamic State. Right, they had customs houses, for example. So when foreign fighters went to join them and sort of illegally cross the border from Gaziantep, Turkey into Syria, they were fingerprinted and they filled out a customs declaration with their name, their sort of job, their blood type, what they wanted to do in the Islamic State. And if you can capture enough of that data, you can get a sense of the whole network. And then you can disrupt the pieces that are actually most consequential. It's not the rank and file terrorist. It's the person who's sort of keeping the records and connecting all of these disparate dots across countries and even across continents.
What acts are often confused with terrorism, and how can we distinguish them?
Yeah, so in the United States, school shootings and other types of sort of non-ideological violence. And so there's a really great example in the form of the Austin, Texas mail bombing. And a lot of people thought that was sort of terrorism, and it looked very, very similar. And people were indeed terrorized by the activity. But sort of the critical distinction is an underlying ideology and sort of political aim. And in that case, the individual in question wasn't pro or against abortion, wasn't pro the Islamic State or pro sort of some neo-Nazi group or anything of that sort. He had no apparent political, economic, social, etc. agenda. And you often sort of see this with sort of school shooters who definitely terrorize local communities, and they're often acting out as a result of being bullied or something of that sort, but they don't tend to have sort of these manifestos, right? They're not sort of pledging their allegiance to the Islamic State and sort of the ideologies that go with it. So it's easy for the mass media to sort of conflate the two because they're both sort of really graphic violence that hit home, but there is sort of that difference. So we need to tackle both problems. They're both serious problems, but we should also sort of recognize that they're distinct, and the approaches that are going to be effective at countering terrorism, i.e. targeting the grievances, are not going to work with the school shooter who isn't rebelling against the capitalist system, for example.
That makes sense. Which country is most affected by terrorism, and how can the level that they're experiencing be reduced?
So it's conflict zones. The best predictor of sort of terrorism tomorrow is sort of violent interstate conflict today. Recruitment's much, much easier in a place with high levels of instability. There's often easy access to weapons, etc. The sort of Western media is inherently biased. I don't mean this as a critique against sort of one outlet or the other, but we print what people are likely to read. If there's a successful attack or even a failed attack on the New York City subway system, it's going to be in every paper on every news channel. Another attack in sort of Syria, and we're never going to hear about it unless we happen to be sort of in Syria and watching this very, very closely. So I think it's easy as sort of Westerners to think that the United States is sort of target number one. The empirical data suggests the opposite is true. You see the overwhelming majority of terrorism isolated to a handful, a couple dozen conflict zones around the world that have been extremely violent for years, if not decades. And that's just not going to change. There's not much you can do about that except to sort of pursue peaceful outcomes in those environments. And in some cases, that's not a realistic goal, at least in the short term.
That makes sense. What are the main types of terrorism that exist in the world today?
Yeah, so I'm not sure exactly what the intent was behind that question. So I'll try and answer it, and if whoever sort of put it in wants to sort of follow up in the chat or whatnot, I'm happy to if I miss the mark. But generally speaking, terrorism is about changing the status quo in some way. So sort of terrorist groups are typically looking to either overthrow and sort of replace a political system. So you can think sort of Sendero Luminoso, the Shining Path in Peru. They wanted to burn down Peruvian democracy and replace it with sort of their interpretation of a Maoist utopia. They may be looking not to change who's in power or how the system is run, but to change specific policies. And there's a group called the Earth Liberation Front that's particularly popular in the, not popular, but particularly violent in the United Kingdom. And they don't care who's governing the United Kingdom. They don't want to do away with British democracy. They do want more eco-friendly laws. So they'll tend to sort of perpetrate attacks against sort of planned housing communities that aren't particularly environmentally efficient, or against sort of car dealerships that sell big gas-hungry SUVs, et cetera. So they care about a single issue. You get the same thing in the United States around abortion rights, with some individuals sort of escalating to violence in order to sort of prove their point on that single issue. You get sort of territorial control, and you see this with some of the PKK, sort of Kurdish groups, who are fighting for sort of some degree of sovereignty or self-determination over lands, and in their case across 4 countries that they have historical sort of ties to. And then in addition, you get sort of population control, and this tends to occur where groups have already been reasonably successful. So the Taliban, for example, had very strict beliefs in how society should be governed, right? Women should not be educated, men should grow beards, music should not be allowed. And so they use terrorism as a sort of behave as we say or else type approach. And then finally, I know I said terrorism is principally about changing the status quo. However, you do occasionally see terrorism that's motivated towards maintaining the status quo. So a great example of this would be the KKK in the sort of immediate post-Civil War South. White Anglo-Saxon Protestants were the dominant sort of majority in the South immediately following the Civil War, but they also saw the writing on the wall that dominance was going to erode relatively quickly, and they used terrorism to try and slow down the erosion of their dominance. That's sort of a rarer type, but it does happen. If the question was about sort of which groups are most prolific, that's varied over time. In sort of the 1970s, it was very much sort of economic sort of motivation, so a lot of Marxist Maoist terrorism. In the 1990s and 2000s, it was very much sort of religiously motivated sort of violent extremism and terrorism. What we're seeing now is a rise of sort of largely rightist extremism, so far-right groups engaging in violence, at least in sort of the U.S. and sort of Western European context, although you do see this in Ukraine and in Russia as well, with some sort of fringe groups who have embraced extreme ideologies and have also sort of used that conflict to their benefit, right? These types of conflicts are a great way for terrorist organizations to get battlefield military experience, to get access to arms, et cetera, et cetera. So you'll see some of the fringes of that around sort of other violent conflicts, and indeed that's happening in Ukraine and Russia today.
How do political considerations and restrictions on the use of force limit the effectiveness of counterterrorism operations?
I'd argue that they actually improve the effectiveness, because the goal, the focus ought not to be on the individual target, in which case there may be limitations, but on sort of how this action is perceived by the sort of broader population. And so there was a great sort of study done by a couple of researchers at the RAND Corporation in the Pakistani tribal areas, and they looked at the use of the U.S. drone strike, and these were overwhelmingly unpopular. And they did an interview with an individual whose uncle was killed in a drone strike, and the individual was upset, and he articulated that he was primarily upset by the sort of cowardly way in which his uncle was killed. He was willing to admit that his uncle was a member of the TTP, the Pakistani Taliban, and was in his word, a bad dude, and probably deserved to die. But his issue was with the way in which he was killed. And that's consequential, right? That may not resonate with you or I, but it is really meaningful in terms of that local context. Because does that kid who's now upset about how his uncle was killed, not whether or not his uncle deserved to die or was a bad individual, go and join a group? And what about the rest of the family, and so on and so forth?
I know we're over time. Our last question, then we can turn it back to Dr. Durbeck to close out. Are there any special cases or highlights you have found in your research related to the progress in terms of the fight against terrorism?
Special cases in terms of what? I'm sorry, you broke up just a little bit there.
Any progress in terms of the fight against terrorism? Any highlights or positive findings you found in your research?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I was just in Kazakhstan last month, working with sort of our Central Asian partners, and they've done a really amazing job of repatriating their own citizens who've gone over to fight with the Islamic State and other groups, and were sort of languishing in these detention facilities in Syria, which was horribly sort of dangerous. There was no real positive control. They could have escaped at any moment. And sort of no country around the world really wants to take their citizens back after they've engaged in this type of behavior, but it's the safest option. And our sort of Central Asian as well as our Balkan partners have been sort of the front runners in this space. There's about 180 something countries that are saying, nope, not our problem. There's about 10 or so that are saying, we want to be on the front lines of fixing this. And so that was a really sort of amazing experience, getting to hear about their experiences and what's going well, as hey, there's still a lot of improvement that needs to happen, but they were sort of honest about it and willing to put in the effort. So I really enjoyed working with our sort of Kazakh, Uzbek, and Tajik partners on this.
Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Durbeck, to close out.
Barnett, thank you very, very much for a highly informational and fascinating behind-the-scene view of counterterrorism and the approach to its elimination. I'm just delighted that you were able to come and share that with us, and I wish you continued success in all of your work. Susie, thank you very much for moderating, and have a very good week and take good care of yourself. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. This is a pleasure. Thank you all.